Footsteps Outside Your Door. Written and narrated by Gregory Sparrow. Welcome to Whispers of Shadow. If you hear footsteps outside your door tonight, do not open it. Do not look through the peephole. Do not answer, because according to an old legend, there is something that appears only after midnight. It doesn't want to come inside. It never has. It waits, quietly, patiently, for you to come out. And when you finally open the door, it doesn't take you immediately. First, it lets you take a single step into the darkness, then another, and another, until you realize you're no longer standing in your home. You're no longer standing in your town. You're not even standing in your world. And behind you, the door is gone. Prologue. The first official record appeared in the autumn of 1873. A single line buried deep inside a forgotten police report. The handwriting was faded, the paper stained by time. Yet the sentence remained perfectly readable. Missing person. Witnesses reported hearing footsteps outside the victim's room shortly before disappearance. At first, authorities dismissed it as coincidence. Then, another report surfaced, and another, and another. Entire families vanished. Travelers disappeared from locked hotel rooms. Children woke screaming about footsteps in the hallway. Some victims were eventually found, but those who returned were never the same. Most refused to speak. Others spent the rest of their lives terrified of closed doors. Several ended up in psychiatric institutions. Every account shared the same details. The footsteps always arrived after midnight. They always stopped directly outside the door. And sooner or later, a familiar voice followed. Not a monster's voice. Not an unknown voice. A loved one's voice. A mother's voice. A father's voice, a spouse's voice, sometimes even the voice of someone who had been dead for years. The voice always said the same thing, only 3 words. Come outside, please. By the beginning of the 20th century, people living in the mountains had stopped treating the phenomenon as a superstition. They began treating it as a rule, a survival rule. If you hear footsteps after midnight, you stay inside, no matter what happens, no matter who calls your name, no matter what you hear, because, according to the oldest version of the legend, the thing outside your door isn't trying to enter your home. It is trying to replace you. Autumn 1998. Rain had covered the mountains for nearly a week. Fog drifted through the valleys like smoke. The forests surrounding the town looked endless. Dark, silent, watching. 27-year-old graduate student Mark Wysocki arrived just before sunset. His thesis focused on forgotten folklore and rural legends. When he first heard about the Footsteps legend, he considered it perfect research material. An isolated mountain town, a century-old mystery, generations of witnesses, everything a historian could hope for. The locals, however, were strangely reluctant to discuss it. Whenever Mark mentioned the legend, conversations stopped. People changed subjects. Some simply walked away. Others stared at him with expressions he couldn't understand. Not fear, something closer to concern, as though they knew he was asking the wrong questions. By evening, Mark checked into an aging guest house standing at the edge of town. The building overlooked the forest. Its wooden walls creaked constantly in the wind. The owner was an elderly woman named Helena. She handed him an old brass key and pointed toward the second floor. Before he climbed the stairs, she spoke. "You're here to study the legend, aren't you?" Mark smiled. That obvious. Helena didn't smile back. "Just remember something." "What?" "If you hear footsteps tonight." She paused. For the first time, Mark noticed genuine fear in her eyes. "Don't open the door." Mark laughed politely. She didn't, and somehow that bothered him. The room was small but comfortable. A narrow bed, a desk, a wardrobe, a single window overlooking the forest. By midnight, rain hammered against the glass. Mark sat at the desk reviewing old newspaper clippings. Many contained stories of disappearances. Most lacked details. A few included witness testimonies. One statement caught his attention. A man who vanished in 1964 had left behind a handwritten note. The note contained only one sentence. "The footsteps stopped outside my room again." Nothing else. No explanation. No farewell. Just that. Mark checked the time. 12:47 a.m. The guest house was silent. He continued reading. A few minutes later, he heard something. A sound from the hallway. A single footstep, then another, then another. Slow, heavy, measured. The noise echoed through the old building. Mark froze. At first, he assumed another guest was walking outside. Then he remembered something. Helena had told him he was the only guest staying on the second floor. The footsteps continued. Closer, 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 until they stopped directly outside his room. Silence followed. A long silence. The kind that makes your ears strain for the smallest sound. Then came 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Mark looked toward the door. His heart was suddenly beating much faster. He wasn't frightened. Not yet. just uneasy. The knocks came again. 3 more. Slow, patient, waiting. Mark stood, walked across the room, and stopped beside the door. For several seconds, neither side moved. Then he heard breathing, very faint, very close, as though someone stood only inches away. He leaned toward the peephole and looked. The hallway was empty. No one stood outside. No one. Yet the breathing continued, directly beyond the door. A cold sensation crawled up his spine. Then a voice whispered, soft, almost gentle. A voice he hadn't heard in years. His father's voice. Mark. His blood turned to ice. The voice came again. Exactly the same. Every detail perfect. Every inflection identical. Mark, open the door. Mark stepped backward so quickly he nearly fell over the chair behind him. His father had died 8 years earlier, a heart attack, sudden, unexpected. There was no possibility of mistake, no possibility of misunderstanding. And yet, the voice outside sounded exactly like him. Not similar, not close. Perfect. The same calm tone. The same rhythm. Even the slight rasp that had developed in the last years of his life. For several seconds, Mark couldn't move. The voice spoke again. Soft, patient, almost comforting. Mark, it's cold out here. A chill spread through his body. The words themselves weren't frightening. It was the certainty behind them. As though whoever stood outside genuinely expected him to open the door. As though it had done this many times before. Mark forced himself away from the entrance. His academic curiosity finally gave way to caution. He grabbed the small tape recorder from his desk and pressed record. The red light flickered on. The footsteps did not return. Only the voice. Mark. A pause. Then, please. The word sounded heartbreakingly human. For a brief moment, an image flashed through his mind. His father standing outside, cold, alone, waiting. The thought felt absurd, impossible. Yet some part of his brain wanted to believe it, wanted to open the door, wanted to see. That realization frightened him more than the voice itself, because the urge felt unnatural, foreign, as though it wasn't entirely his own. Minutes passed. Eventually the whispering stopped. The hallway became silent once more. At around 3 a.m, exhaustion finally overcame fear. Mark fell asleep, fully dressed. The next morning, he awoke to sunlight pushing through gray clouds. For a moment, he convinced himself it had all been a dream. Then He noticed the tape recorder, still running, still recording. His stomach tightened. After breakfast, he played the tape for Helena. The old woman listened without interruption. When the recording reached the voice, she turned pale. When it ended, she stared out the window for several seconds. Finally, she spoke. "You're lucky." Mark frowned. "Lucky?" "You didn't answer." "I wasn't going to." She shook her head slowly. "Most people say that." The room fell silent. "What happens if someone does answer?" Helena looked at him. The expression in her eyes unsettled him, because it wasn't fear. It was certainty. "They leave." "Leave where?" "No one knows." Later that day, Mark visited the town archives. The building occupied an abandoned church, converted into a historical repository decades earlier. Dust covered nearly every shelf. Most records had not been touched in years. He spent hours reviewing old reports, disappearances, missing persons, witness statements. At first, the cases appeared unrelated, different decades, different families, different circumstances. Then a pattern emerged. Every victim had heard footsteps shortly before vanishing. Every single one. And there was something else. Many victims left messages behind. Short messages, fragments, notes, diary entries. The wording varied, but the meaning remained the same. They all described a hallway that should not exist. One entry from 1931 read, "The corridor is longer every night." Another from 1954, "There are doors on both sides, thousands of them." A third from 1978, "I can hear people behind the doors. They sound like me." Mark copied everything. By sunset, his notebook was full, and for the first time since arriving in town, he began to suspect the legend might be more than folklore. That evening, a storm rolled across the mountains. The forest vanished behind sheets of rain. Thunder shook the guest house walls. Electricity flickered repeatedly. Around 11 o'clock, Helena knocked on Mark's room. She handed him a small wooden box. "I found this years ago." Inside was a stack of photographs, black and white, damaged by age. Most showed the town decades earlier. One image immediately caught his attention. It depicted a group of townspeople standing outside the guest house. The photograph appeared normal at first. Then Mark noticed something in the background, behind the building. At the edge of the forest, a figure. Tall, unnaturally tall. Its body seemed too thin, its limbs too long, almost distorted. The figure was partially hidden between trees, yet once Mark noticed it, he couldn't stop looking. "What is that?" he asked. Helena's face darkened. "No one knows." "Who took the picture?" My grandfather. What happened to him? She hesitated, then answered. He disappeared 3 days later. A bolt of lightning illuminated the room. For an instant, the figure in the photograph seemed almost alive, watching, waiting. Mark looked away. That night, he decided to set up equipment. 2 cameras, one pointed toward the door, the other toward the hallway through a slightly opened crack. He connected everything to a portable monitor. If something appeared outside his room, he intended to capture it. Midnight arrived. Then 1 o'clock. Nothing happened. The storm intensified. Wind rattled the windows. Rain pounded the roof. Mark began to wonder if the previous night had been a coincidence. Then the monitor flickered. Static burst across the screen, only for a second. Then everything returned to normal. A minute later, it happened again, this time longer. The image distorted. Horizontal lines crawled across the display. The hallway camera briefly showed something impossible. A corridor extending far beyond the actual dimensions of the building. Then the picture snapped back. Mark stared. His pulse accelerated. The guest house hallway was only 10 meters long. What he had just seen stretched endlessly into darkness. He replayed the footage. The impossible corridor appeared again, only for 3 frames, 3 fractions of a second. Yet it was there, undeniably there. And at the far end, something moved. A silhouette, too distant to identify, too tall to be human. Then the footsteps began. Slow, heavy, measured, exactly like before. One after another, drawing closer, 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 until they stopped directly outside his door. The monitor suddenly filled with static. The room temperature dropped. And from the hallway came a voice. Not his father's this time, his mother's, dead for 6 years, soft, gentle, loving. Mark. The tears that instantly filled his eyes shocked him, because for one impossible moment he wanted to believe. He wanted it to be real. The voice continued, "Please come outside." Then another voice joined it. His father. Then another. His grandmother. Then another. His childhood friend. Then dozens more, layered together, speaking in perfect harmony, all asking the same thing, all wanting the same thing. Come outside. Mark backed away from the door. Every instinct screamed at him to stay where he was. Then the handle began to move, very slowly, very carefully, as though someone on the other side was testing the lock. And for the first time, the footsteps resumed. Not away from the room, not down the corridor, but directly through the wall, as though whatever stood outside no longer needed the hallway at all. The handle stopped moving. The voices stopped with it. The room became silent, not normal silence, a deeper silence, the kind that feels wrong, as though the world itself is holding its breath. Mark stood frozen in the center of the room, his eyes locked on the door, waiting, listening. Nothing happened. Then a sudden burst of static erupted from the monitor. The hallway camera went black. The second camera continued recording. But something had changed. The corridor outside his room no longer looked familiar. The wallpaper was gone. The lights were gone. The wooden floor had disappeared. Instead, the camera showed a narrow passage stretching into darkness, an impossible corridor, exactly like the descriptions in the old reports, exactly like the notes left behind by the missing. Mark grabbed the monitor and stared. The image could not be real, yet it was there. Every detail visible. The corridor extended so far that darkness swallowed its end. Rows of doors lined both sides. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. Identical. Silent. Waiting. The camera shook slightly. Not because of a technical malfunction, because someone was holding it. The realization hit him instantly. The camera mounted outside his room wasn't fixed anymore. It was moving, as though an invisible person had removed it from the wall, and was now carrying it deeper into the corridor. Mark watched in horror as the image drifted forward, passing door after door, each one identical, each one closed. The static grew louder. The footage became unstable. Then, for a fraction of a second, one door opened. Only a few centimeters. A pale face appeared in the gap. A human face. Terrified. Crying. Its mouth moved. The sound never came through. The image jumped. The face vanished. The door slammed shut. The corridor continued endlessly. Mark felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't looking at a recording. The camera was broadcasting live. Whatever existed beyond the door was interacting with his equipment, watching him. At dawn, he left the guest house and returned to the archives. He needed answers, not legends, not stories. Answers. Hours later, he discovered something hidden inside an old storage room, a sealed metal cabinet. Most of its contents had been forgotten decades earlier. Inside were police files marked confidential. Many documents were missing. Others had been deliberately blacked out. But one file remained almost untouched. Case number 44-17. Year 1944. The subject, mass disappearance, St. Bartholomew Shelter, according to the report. 23 people had taken refuge in a mountain shelter during a snowstorm. Only one survived. His statement filled 12 pages. Most of it had been classified. Yet one paragraph remained readable. Mark read it 3 times. Then a 4th. Then a 5th. Because he could hardly believe what it said. The footsteps arrived shortly after midnight. At first, we believed someone was trapped outside. Then we heard familiar voices. People began opening doors. Some walked into the hallway willingly. Others claimed they saw family members waiting for them. When I finally looked, the shelter was gone. The hallway was gone. There was only a corridor stretching beyond sight. And behind every door, something was trying to become human. Mark lowered the file. His hands were shaking. Something was trying to become human. The sentence echoed in his mind again and again and again. Suddenly many things began making sense. The voices, the disappearances, the strange urge to open the door, the impossible corridor. Perhaps whatever existed there wasn't hunting people. Perhaps it needed them, needed their memories, their identities, their faces, a replacement, a template, a way out. That evening, Helena finally told him something she had hidden since his arrival. Her brother had disappeared 30 years earlier. He was 14. The footsteps came one winter night. The family heard them. Everyone stayed in their rooms. Everyone except him. By morning, he was gone. No footprints, no broken locks, nothing. Just an open bedroom door, and one sentence written on the wall beside it. The words had been scratched into the wood, deep enough to leave scars that remained visible decades later. Helena still remembered every letter, because she had stared at them for years. The sentence read, "It learned my name." That night, the storm returned, stronger than before. The electricity failed completely shortly after midnight. The guest house sank into darkness. Mark sat alone with a flashlight and a tape recorder. Outside, rain hammered the windows. The forest swayed beneath violent winds. The clock reached 12:58. Then 12:59. Then 1 o'clock. The footsteps began immediately. No delay, no warning. One step, another, closer, 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 until they stopped directly outside his room. Mark remained still, his breathing shallow. The tape recorder captured everything. The silence that followed felt endless. Then came a sound he had never heard before. A second set of footsteps. Inside the room, behind him. His blood froze. Very slowly he turned. The room was empty, yet the footsteps continued, circling him, moving around the bed, around the desk, around the walls, invisible, patient, as though something had finally crossed the threshold. And then the voice spoke, not from outside, not from the hallway, from directly behind his shoulder, a whisper so close he could feel its breath. Mark. He spun around. Nothing. Only darkness. Only shadows. Only the sound of rain. Then the whisper returned. From somewhere else. A different corner. Closer. Mark. A pause. Then words that made his heart stop. You're already inside. Mark didn't sleep, not even for a minute. The words repeated endlessly inside his head. You're already inside. Every logical explanation he had relied upon since arriving in town was beginning to collapse. A prank? Impossible. Mass hallucination? Unlikely. A local conspiracy? It no longer fit the evidence. Too many witnesses. Too many decades. Too many disappearances. And now, the impossible footage, the voices, the corridor, the whisper that had spoken from inside his room. As dawn approached, Mark replayed the tape recorder. The footsteps were clearly audible. The voices were there too, but something else appeared near the end of the recording. Something he hadn't heard during the night. A second voice, much quieter, almost hidden beneath the static. He increased the volume, listened again, and felt his stomach twist. The voice wasn't speaking to him. It was speaking about him, as though someone were observing him from a distance, as though he were being watched. The recording said, he can see it now. A pause. Static. Then, he is beginning to remember. Remember? Remember what? Mark had never been to this town before. At least, he thought he hadn't. That afternoon, he visited the oldest resident still alive. An 89-year-old man named Anton Richter. Anton lived alone in a weathered farmhouse overlooking the valley. When Mark mentioned the footsteps, the old man's expression changed immediately. Not fear. Recognition. The look of someone hearing a story he had known all his life. Without a word, Anton disappeared into another room. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Most were faded beyond recognition. One photograph, however, remained surprisingly clear. Anton placed it on the table. Mark stared and felt the blood drain from his face. The photograph had been taken in 1972, more than 25 years before Mark arrived in town. Yet, standing among a crowd of villagers was Mark, or someone who looked exactly like him. Same face, same eyes, same hair, everything identical. The photograph slipped from his fingers. This is impossible. Anton nodded slowly. I said the same thing. What is this? The old man looked out the window toward the forest, then answered. The third time. Mark's pulse accelerated. What does that mean? Anton remained silent for several seconds. Finally he whispered, You're not the first, Mark Wysocki. The room suddenly felt colder. What are you talking about? Anton took a deep breath. Every few decades someone arrives. Someone exactly like you. Mark laughed nervously. This is some kind of joke. No. The old man shook his head. I wish it were. He opened the box again. More photographs emerged. Different decades. Different generations. The same face. The same man. Always appearing shortly before major disappearances. Always staying in the guest house. Always vanishing. Every photograph showed him, or someone indistinguishable from him. Mark could barely breathe. His rational mind desperately searched for an explanation, a family resemblance, coincidence, forgery, anything. Yet none of those possibilities survived scrutiny. The resemblance wasn't strong. It was absolute, as though the same person had been photographed repeatedly across a century. That evening, he returned to the guest house, carrying the photographs. The forest seemed different now, darker, closer, watching. Even the road felt unfamiliar, as though the town itself had begun shifting around him. Helena noticed the photographs immediately. Her face turned pale. You found Anton. Mark nodded. What does he mean? She didn't answer. Instead, she walked upstairs. Several minutes later, she returned carrying an old leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle with age. The name on the cover had almost faded completely, but one line remained readable. Property of Mark Wysocki. Date 1903. Mark stared at it. His hands trembled. This isn't possible. Helena slowly opened the book. The handwriting inside matched his own. Every letter, every curve, every stroke. Identical. The final entry was written across several pages. The ink had smeared in places, as though the author had been writing in panic. The entry read, The corridor remembers us. Every time it loses one of its own, it reaches into our world. It copies a life. It learns a face. Then it sends the face back. I don't know how many times this has happened. I don't know which version I am. But I know one thing. Something is trying to cross over, and it needs someone to open the last door. The entry ended abruptly. No signature, no conclusion, nothing. only a final line written so deeply into the paper that it tore through the page. If you hear footsteps, it already knows your name. That night, the power failed again. This time, no storm accompanied it. No wind, no rain, no thunder, just darkness. Complete darkness, the kind that swallows shapes, the kind that makes familiar places feel alien. Mark sat alone in his room, the journal resting beside him, the tape recorder running. A camera pointed toward the door. The clock reached midnight, then 12:30, then 12:45. Silence. For the first time since arriving, the footsteps didn't come. That should have reassured him. Instead, it terrified him, because the absence felt intentional, like a predator hiding, waiting, watching. At exactly 1:13 a.m., the camera flickered. Static exploded across the screen. The image disappeared, then returned. The room was unchanged, except for one thing, the door. It was standing open, only a few inches. Mark immediately looked up. The real door remained closed, locked, yet on the monitor it was open. The camera continued recording, slowly, very slowly. The gap widened. The darkness beyond it deepened. And from that darkness emerged a hand, long, pale, almost human. Its fingers were too long. Its joints bent the wrong way. The hand gripped the edge of the doorway. Then another appeared, and another, and another. Dozens of hands, all pulling, all widening the opening, as though something massive was trying to force reality apart. Mark couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't look away. The opening widened further, and for the first time, he saw what existed beyond the corridor. Rows of doors, thousands of them, stretching forever, and standing among them were people, hundreds of people, silent, motionless, watching. Every face turned toward him, every face filled with terror, and among them he saw his father. Mark stumbled backward. The monitor crashed to the floor. The screen flickered violently. Static filled the room, but the image remained visible. His father was there, standing among hundreds of silent figures, not moving, not speaking, simply staring. The same jacket, the same face, the same eyes Mark remembered from childhood. For one impossible second, he forgot every warning, every legend, every report, every missing person. He wanted to open the door. He wanted to reach him. He wanted to believe. Then the figure smiled, and Mark's blood froze, because his father never smiled that way. The expression was wrong, too wide, too still, too perfect, like someone imitating a human emotion without understanding it. The smile spread further. Around him, the other figures began smiling too. Hundreds of faces, all identical, all unnatural, all watching. The monitor went black. The room plunged into silence. At dawn, Mark made a decision. He could leave, drive away, forget everything, pretend none of this had happened. But he already knew he wouldn't, because something had changed. The corridor wasn't merely haunting the town, it was connected to him. The photographs proved that. The journal proved that. Whatever was happening had been happening for generations, and somehow he was part of it. That afternoon, Helena finally revealed the last secret. Beneath the guest house existed an underground chamber, a room hidden since the 19th century. Her family had guarded it for decades. No one entered anymore. No one wanted to. The entrance lay beneath a trap door, concealed under old floorboards in the cellar. The air below smelled ancient. Dust coated every surface. The walls were covered with handwritten messages, thousands of them, layer upon layer, decades of warnings, desperate notes, names, dates, prayers. Among them, Mark found the same sentence repeated over and over, written by different people, different handwriting, different years, yet always the same words. Do not open the last door. The deeper they descended, the colder the air became. Eventually they reached the final chamber. The room was circular, windowless, silent. At its center stood a single wooden door. Nothing else. No walls connected to it. No frame. No structure supporting it. Just a door standing alone in the darkness, as though someone had placed it there centuries ago and forgotten it. Helena stopped immediately. She refused to move closer. I've never crossed this room. Mark stared at the door. Something about it felt familiar, not visually, emotionally, like a memory he couldn't quite reach. The wood was old, cracked, covered in scratches, thousands of scratches, as though generations had tried desperately to keep it closed. Then Mark noticed something carved into the surface, a date below it, and beneath them all, fresh, newly carved, waiting. That night, Mark returned alone. The town slept beneath thick fog. The streets were empty. No lights shone from the windows. No dogs barked. No sounds came from the forest. It felt as though the entire valley was holding its breath. The underground chamber seemed colder than before. The door stood motionless in the darkness, waiting. Mark placed the old journal beside it. Then he noticed something he had missed. A final page hidden inside the back cover, folded, almost glued together by age. His hands trembled as he opened it. The message contained only a few lines, written in the same handwriting as the rest. His handwriting. If you are reading this, then I failed. The corridor is not a place. It is a prison. The people behind the doors are real. The voices are real. The missing are real. They are trapped. Something feeds on identity. It learns people, copies them, replaces them. Every cycle it grows stronger. Every cycle it comes closer. The last door is the only barrier left. If it opens, there will be no more doors, no more corridors, only it. The journal ended there. Mark slowly lowered the page and heard footsteps, not above, not outside. Inside the chamber, heavy, measured, slow. The sound echoed through the darkness. One step, another, coming from behind the wooden door. Something was walking there, something enormous, something patient. The footsteps stopped. Then came silence. Then a voice, his father's voice. Mark. A pause. Help us. His mother's voice joined it. Then his grandmother's, then dozens more. Hundreds, thousands. An entire crowd speaking from beyond the door, begging, crying, calling his name. Please, open it. We're trapped. Help us. The chamber shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. The wooden door vibrated. And then something else spoke. A voice unlike the others. Deep, ancient, wrong, not imitating humanity anymore, not pretending, its true voice. The voice of whatever had waited behind the footsteps for more than a century. And it said, "You finally remember." Mark stood motionless in the darkness. The chamber felt smaller now, the air heavier. Every shadow seemed alive. The voice echoed through the stone walls. You finally remember. At first, nothing happened. Then memories began to surface. Not his memories, someone else's. Images flashed through his mind. A snowstorm in 1903. A lantern trembling in frozen hands. The sound of footsteps outside a wooden room. A man opening a door. Darkness beyond. Then another memory. A woman standing in a hotel hallway, hearing her dead son call her name. Opening a door, stepping forward. Vanishing, another. A farmer walking into fog, following his wife's voice. Never returning. The visions accelerated. Hundreds. Thousands. lives, faces, disappearances, each one connected, each one ending the same way. A door, a voice, a step into darkness. Mark fell to his knees. The truth crashed into him all at once. The photographs, the journal, the repeating face, the cycles. He finally understood. The people in the photographs were not his ancestors. They were him, or rather, versions of him, copies, replacements. Each generation, the corridor sent one back. A fragment, a borrowed identity, a manufactured life, someone who would eventually return to the last door, someone who would eventually remember, someone who would eventually choose. And now it was Mark's turn. The footsteps resumed, louder, closer, directly behind the wooden door. Each step shook the floor. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Cracks spread across the stone walls. Whatever stood beyond was approaching, and it was enormous, far larger than any human being, far larger than anything that should exist. The voices behind the door became frantic, screaming, begging, crying. "Don't open it! Run! Leave! It's lying!" Then the ancient voice spoke again. Calm, certain, patient. "They are afraid." Another step. The chamber shook violently. "They fear freedom." Another step. The wood groaned. "Open the door." Mark stared at the handle. A simple brass handle, worn smooth by time. The object responsible for a century of disappearances. The barrier separating two realities. The last door. For a moment, he considered leaving, but deep inside, he knew the truth. If he walked away, someone else would eventually arrive. Another cycle, another victim, another century. The thing behind the door would keep growing, keep learning, keep waiting, until one day the barrier failed, until one day nobody remained to stop it. Then he noticed something carved into the floor, a circle surrounding the door, hidden beneath decades of dust. Symbols, hundreds of them, names, thousands of names. Every missing person, every victim, every disappearance, all connected, all forming a prison. The realization struck him instantly. The door wasn't keeping people out. It was keeping something in. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a single sound, a hand touching the opposite side of the door. The wood bent inward, slowly, like paper. Something was pressing against it. Something impossibly strong. The shape of fingers emerged through the surface. Long, thin, far too many joints. The wood began cracking. The prison was failing. Mark understood what had to happen. The journal had never been a warning. It had been instructions. Every version of him, every cycle, every lifetime, had led to this moment. He stepped forward, placed his hand on the handle, and instead of pulling it open, he turned the lock. A lock hidden beneath the brass plate. A lock no one had noticed for a century. The chamber exploded with noise. The voices screamed. The entity roared. The sound was unlike anything human, unlike anything alive. The stone walls cracked. The floor trembled. The handle burned beneath his fingers, but Mark kept turning. Once, twice, 3 times. The final mechanism clicked into place. Then everything stopped. Instantly. Silence. Absolute silence. The pressure vanished. The footsteps vanished. The voices vanished. The darkness itself seemed to retreat. For several seconds, Mark heard nothing except his own breathing. Then the names carved into the floor began to glow. Thousands of names. One by one, like distant stars. The chamber filled with pale light. And, for the first time, the voices returned. But now they sounded different. Peaceful, relieved, free. The names slowly faded, one after another, until only a single name remained. Mark Wysocki. Then it vanished too. The chamber collapsed minutes later. By the time Helena reached the cellar, everything was gone. The room, the door, the symbols, the journal, all of it. Only rubble remained. And Mark was nowhere to be found. Epilogue. The official report listed Mark Wysocki as a missing person, another unsolved disappearance, another file, another mystery. The town eventually returned to normal. Years passed, then decades. No more footsteps were reported. No more voices. No more disappearances. The legend slowly faded until it became just another story. Something parents told children around campfires. Something people laughed about. Something forgotten. But in the autumn of 2025, a maintenance worker renovating an abandoned mountain hotel discovered an old cassette tape hidden inside a wall. Most of the recording was damaged. Static covered nearly everything. Only a few seconds survived. The audio begins with silence, then breathing, then a familiar sound. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, measured, approaching. Closer, 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 until they stop directly in front of the microphone. Several seconds pass. Then a voice whispers, "We found another door." The recording ends immediately afterward, and according to the oldest version of the legend, the corridor never dies. It only waits for someone to hear the footsteps again, for someone to answer, for someone to open the door. And if you hear footsteps outside your room tonight, don't open it. Recovered audio file, source unknown, recovery date unknown, original recording date corrupted, status partial recovery. For several seconds, there is only static, a low electrical hum, then breathing, very faint, very controlled, as though someone is trying not to be heard. The recording quality is poor. Fragments of interference distort every word. Then a man's voice begins speaking, weak, exhausted, shaken. It is unmistakably Mark. If you're hearing this, static, then the door wasn't sealed. A pause, heavy breathing. I thought I stopped it. Another pause, longer this time. Then I was wrong. Far in the background, something can be heard. A single footstep, very distant, almost impossible to notice. Mark hears it too. His breathing changes immediately, faster now, less controlled. Listen carefully. Another footstep, closer. I don't have much time. Static tears through the recording. The sound briefly disappears. When it returns, Mark is whispering, almost pleading. If you ever hear footsteps outside your room, another step, closer. Do not answer. Another. Do not look through the peephole. Another. Do not listen to the voices. The footsteps continue, slow, patient, unhurried, drawing nearer with every second. Mark's voice begins trembling. It learns. Static. It remembers. Another step. It waits. Another. And eventually, the recording cuts for nearly 2 seconds. When audio returns, Mark sounds terrified, more terrified than at any point in the recovered tapes. It found me again. A loud burst of interference erupts. The microphone distorts. Something heavy moves nearby. Not footsteps anymore. Something larger. Something dragging itself through darkness. The sound fills the recording. Mark begins backing away. His voice cracks. No. A loud impact. Static. Another impact. Much closer. Then silence. Absolute silence. For 3 full seconds, no breathing, no movement, nothing. And then a voice speaks directly into the microphone. So close it almost sounds inside the listener's head. The voice is Mark's, perfectly Mark's. Every detail identical, every inflection identical. except for one thing. There is no emotion in it, no fear, no humanity, only imitation. Don't worry. A pause, soft static, then, this time, another pause, longer, patient, waiting. You'll open the door. The recording ends, but for a fraction of a second before the file cuts out completely. A final sound can be heard. 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Final line for the narrator. And if, tonight, after midnight, you hear footsteps outside your room, remember one thing. According to the legend, it doesn't want to come in. It wants you to come out. End.